Hi, I'm Anna Kathleen Ambasabosa, and I'll talk about my part on the economic integration and cooperation, the seventh chapter of the book International Business, Environments, and Operations. Let's get right to it. In the mid to late 1940s, many nations decided that if they were going to emerge from the wreckage of World War II and promote economic growth and stability within their borders, they would have to assist and get assistance from nearby countries. In some respects, the United States is the perfect example of such economic integration. But what about the rest of the world? How do its nations and regions combine forces to give and gain the assistance they need to prosper together? Economic integration is a term used to describe the political and monetary agreements among nations and world regions, in which preference is given to member countries. There are three major ways to approach such agreements. First is global integration. Countries from all over the world decide to cooperate through the World Trade Organization or WTO. Second, bilateral integration, wherein two countries decide to cooperate more closely together, usually in the form of tariff reductions. And third, regional integration, wherein a group of countries located in the same geographic proximity decide to cooperate, as with the European Union. Why do we need to understand the nature of these agreements? Trade groups, whether global, bilateral, or regional, are important influence on the multinational enterprises' strategies. They can define the size of the regional market and the rules under which a company must operate. In fact, an increase in market size is their single most important reason for existing. A company in the initial stages of foreign expansion must be aware of how the groups encompass countries with good manufacturing locations or market opportunities. Thus, it must change its organizational structure and operating strategies to continually benefit from these alliances. Multinational enterprises are interested in regional trade groups because they tend to be regional as well. Current research demonstrates that most generate most of their revenues in their home regions. However, companies that sell in their own region are also interested in trade agreements with other regions because of their potential to affect the regions where they source their purchases and to reduce costs and improve quality. The World Trade Organization global integration. Governments often actively cooperate with each other to remove trade barriers. The following discussion focuses on the World Trade Organization, or WTO, the successor of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, and the major multilateral forum through which governments can come to agreements and settle trade disputes. GATT, predecessor to the WTO. In 1947, 23 countries formed GATT under the auspices of the United Nations to abolish quotas and reduce tariffs. By the time the WTO replaced GATT in 1995, 125 nations had become members. Many believe that GATT's contribution to trade liberalization enabled the expansion of world trade in the second half of the 20th century. The fundamental principle of GATT was that each member nation must open its markets equally to every other member nation. This principle of trade without discrimination was embodied in GATT's most favored nation (MFN) clause. Once a country and its trading partners had agreed to reduce a tariff, that tariff cut was automatically extended to every other member country, irrespective of whether the country was a signatory to the agreement. Over time, GATT grappled with the issue of non-tariff barriers. Then GATT slowly ran into problems, while its success led to some governments to devise craftier methods of trade protection. World trade grew more complex, and trade in services not covered by GATT rules grew more important. Procedurally, GATT's institutional structure and its dispute settlement system seemed increasingly overextended. Moreover, it could not enforce compliance with agreements. These market trends and organizational challenges made trade agreements harder to work out. Restoring an effective means for trade liberalization led officials to create the WTO in 1995. So, what does the WTO do? The WTO adopted the principles and trade agreements reached under the auspices of GATT, but expanded its mission to include trade in services, investment, intellectual property, sanitary measures, plant health, agriculture, and textiles, as well as technical barriers to trade. Its 159 members collectively amount for more than 90% of world trade and included the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, and Russia, which was finally admitted to membership in the year 2012. The WTO continued the MFN clause of GATT, which implies that member countries should trade without discrimination, basically giving foreign products national treatment. Although the WTO restricts this privilege to official members, some exemptions are allowed, as follows. 1. Developing countries' manufactured products have been given preferential treatment over those from industrial countries. 2. Concessions granted to members within a regional trading alliance have not been extended to countries outside the alliance. And third, countries can raise barriers against member countries who they feel are trading unfairly. Exceptions are made in times of war or international tension. One function of the WTO that is garnering growing attention is the organization's dispute settlement mechanism, in which countries may bring charges of unfair trade practices to a WTO panel, and accused countries may appeal. There are limits on all stages of deliberations, and the WTO's rulings are binding. Most of the WTO's agenda was established by negotiations, or rounds, held by GATT, particularly the Uruguay round, which took place from 1986 to 1994 and led up to the creation of the WTO. Perhaps the most complex issues the WTO currently faces, however, are those that it is trying to address through the Doha round, also called the Doha Ministerial Declaration, which commenced in Doha, Qatar, in 2001 with a focus on giving a boost to developing countries on the world scene. The WTO had hoped to scale back expectations on Doha by focusing easier issues, but it has not gained significant traction. Instead, many countries are setting up their own regional and bilateral agreements, much to the dismay of the WTO. The rise of bilateral agreements. As the negotiations over the Doha round broke down, many countries began to shift to bilateral or preferential rather than multilateral free trade agreements. Even though bilateral trade is much simpler than trying to forge a deal in the WTO, neither deal was easy, and it is always difficult to measure the impact in the short run, especially during a time when the global economy is struggling. Regional trade agreements are reciprocal pacts between two or more partners that lie somewhat between bilateral or global integration agreements. According to the WTO, 354 RTAs were in force as of mid-January 2013. Geography matters. It's logical that most trade groups contain countries in the same area of the world. Neighboring nations tend to ally for several reasons. 1. The distances that goods need to travel are short. And 2. Consumers' tastes are likely to be similar, and distribution channels can easily be established. As noted earlier, the major reason to establish a regional trade group is to increase market size. There are two basic types of RTAs from the standpoint of tariff policies. The first one being Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, which has the goal to abolish all tariffs between member countries. And second, Customs Union, wherein in addition to eliminating internal tariffs, member countries levy a common external tariff on goods being imported from non-members in order to establish a customs union. Adding free mobility of production factors to a customs union results in a common market or economic integration agreement. Beyond the reduction of tariffs and non-tariff barriers, countries can enhance their cooperation in a variety of ways. The effects of integration. Regional economic integration can affect member countries in many ways. Initially, however, our focus is on its economic rationale. Static and dynamic effects. Static effects are the shifting of resources from inefficient to efficient companies as trade barriers fall. Static effects may develop when either of two conditions occur. 1. Trade creation, wherein production shifts to more efficient producers for reasons of comparative advantage, allowing consumers access to more goods at lower prices than would have been possible without integration. Or second, trade diversion, wherein trade shifts to countries in the group at the expense of trade with other countries, even though the non-member companies might be more efficient in the absence of trade barriers. Now, dynamic effects are the overall growth in the market and the impact on a company caused by expanding production and by its ability to achieve greater economies of scale. Dynamic effects of integration occur when trade barriers come down and markets grow. Because of that growth, companies can increase their production, which will result in lower cost per unit, a phenomenon we call economies of scale. Companies can produce more cheaply, which is good because they must become more efficient to survive. Another important effect of an RTA is greater efficiency due to increased competition. Many multinational enterprises in Europe have attempted to grow through mergers and acquisitions to achieve this size necessary to compete in the larger market. This could result in investment shifting from less efficient to more efficient companies, or it could result in existing companies becoming more efficient. And that would be all for my part. Thank you and have a great day.